In the movie Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail, there's a scene where they try to discover whether or not a woman is a witch. And they use some very unusual logic. Remember, this is an absurd comedy. Well, they decide that they need to burn her because she's a witch. One guy accuses her of turning him into a newt, but apparently he got better. So they have to decide, well, how do we know whether she's a witch? And they decide, well, if a witch burns, what else burns? And they discover wood burns. And they say, well, what else does wood do? Well, wood floats. Then they ask the question, what else floats? No, it's not churches. No, it's not small rocks. A duck floats. Therefore, their logic is, if the woman weighs the same as a duck, she must be a witch and she must be burned. It's pretty absurd and ludicrous logic, and nobody would follow it, and yet we see that same kind of logic being used in our walking through the Word for today. Welcome to our daily devotional. We're in John chapter 18, and Jesus has been arrested, and Jesus has been before the religious leaders, and now Jesus is going before Pontius Pilate, one of the governors. Now, you might be asking the question as you read this, wait a minute, Jeremy, what about all those other little details that you get in the other Gospels? You know, Jesus didn't just go before Pilate. And you're right, he didn't. But you have to remember what the purpose of each one of the Gospels is. And John has a very specific purpose that he tells us about in actually just a couple of chapters. And we've talked about this at the very beginning of our study of John, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's the purpose of it. So John is not going to add extra fluff. This is one of the reasons that John's is more unique. Remember, he doesn't put parables in there. He is set out for the purpose of helping people discover that Jesus is the Messiah. So John isn't necessarily going to talk about all the details of Jesus' arrest. Instead, he's going to focus on the important details. So he goes straight to Pilate with this conversation, and here's where we discover some of that really bad logic. In verse 28 of John 18, then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Remember, this is all happening on Friday, okay? Early Friday morning. So Pilate came out and asked him, what charges are you bringing against this man? Here comes the logic. Well, if he weren't a criminal, they replied, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. That's their logic. You see, here's the thing about the situation. They don't like Jesus. They want Jesus killed, but the truth is Jesus has done nothing to warrant death. The only death that the religious leaders can choose is one that is what is viewed at the time as a political and or religious decision, and that is that Jesus claims to be the Messiah. That is not anything that breaks Roman law. It breaks Jewish religious law. And so the Jewish leaders recognize that they don't really have power. And so they have to put political pressure on Pontius Pilate. Now, they're able to do this for a couple of different reasons. Probably the most significant one is that region had a history of unrest. Remember, just even 70 years prior, there was the revolt of the Maccabees. And Jesus, in some of his teaching in the Gospels, also teaches of another rebellion that occurred. So this area is full of political unrest. Plus, don't forget that one of Jesus' disciples is known as a zealot. So the governor here is wary that he doesn't want to create a situation that's going to make him look bad in front of the emperor. Okay, he's trying to avoid this. And so he's going to entertain this idea, and ultimately we know what he decides. But we need to understand that this is all solely political pressure. Pilate says, take him and judge him by your own laws. And they reply, well, we have no right. We are not allowed to execute him. And this took place to fulfill what Jesus has said about the kind of death he was going to die. See, here's the thing. The Romans were the only ones that could authorize the type of death that they really wanted for Jesus, which was the most heinous, painful, and horrible death ever thought up by our twisted, demented brains, that of the crucifixion. A death of suffocation and torture, which we will talk about in the coming days. So they say, okay, all right. Then Pontius Pilate goes back to Jesus and says, so this accusation, are you really the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about it?" In other words, they have put this idea in Pilate's brain. And Pilate says, "Well, I don't know. Am I a Jew? I don't know. I don't know their rules and their customs. Your own people did this. They threw you over. So what did you do?" And Jesus says, they talk about me being a king, but here's the thing. My kingdom, it's not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by these leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place. In other words, Jesus is kind of giving Pilate a little bit of an out. Because you see, we do have to understand that Pilate is responsible for the death of Jesus. He doesn't get the out of washing his hands that we're going to see here shortly. Instead, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. So Jesus basically told Pilate, hey, you get a chance to call me a kook if you want. Pilate goes, oh, so you are a king then? And Jesus says, well, you say that I'm a king. And in fact, it's the reason that I was born and to testify is because I am a king. And everyone on the side of truth listens. Pilate, if you're on the side of truth, you're going to listen. To which Pilate gets metaphysical. What is truth? Do you see here that Jesus is carrying out his mission and his duty, and he's using these very people that think they are in control, that think they are in charge, that think they are the bosses. And yet we must never mistake, as we talked about at the end of yesterday, Jesus is not to be pitied, because Jesus is the one that has orchestrated this entire situation.